250th is a big thing across the nation. In Connecticut, we're one of the towns that have come out first with a presentation like this. And I want to thank Sean McNamara and Connecticut Humanities, as well as the Mark Twain Library, for making this possible. And Bruce is in his director's chair. I kind of run the show, and we go back and forth, just like we're talking at home, because Bruce and I talk almost
2-3 times a week.
Pretty much, yeah. So, but when we do something like this, Bruce thinks that it's better if we just wing it. So there's no prior preparation to this outside of the stuff that we know or have read. So that kind of makes it fun too, because I'm not.
These slides didn't make themselves.
No, he makes the slides. When he makes the slides, I look at the slides and say, like, okay, what were you thinking here? How are we transitioning here? And then the magic happens. So. Without further ado, like I said, 250, the revolution actually happened in Redding, Connecticut. So we all know that we have 3 encampments here, but we also know that we had a very special town that we're going to talk about today in terms of, we were unique in terms of having Anglicans, which were Church of England people, and Presbyterians, which we now know as Congregationalists. So we had 2 different religions that probably thought a lot differently about the situation that was happening with the War of the Revolution. So the other thing that we did, and Bruce really brought this on, I think it's very smart, is we're going to talk about what it was really like to live. Not only just the revolution, because it's more than that. Like, how did they live? What did they eat? How did they, set up their houses? Things of that nature. So that I thought was a great ad by Bruce, because you don't really think about that until maybe you lose power for 10 days.
Well, I say this winter is going to be very, very much, so far in January, is very much like the January 1778, when we had 3 encampments here and we had over 3,000 soldiers here. So I want you to think about what the weather's been like of late, and what it would be like living 12 guys to a hut, and a lot of guys with no blankets, no shoes. All the guys from New Hampshire, about half of them had no shoes. So it was very, very difficult times to live there, and not a whole lot of food. So
That's it. Like, we're going to avoid rabbit holes. That's what we talk about most. Like,
we're not good at that.
How do we avoid the rabbit holes? So we'll get going with what was Reading like in this time frame. So we're looking at 1775. So basically you have Reading here with 2 churches. One's the Presbyterian and one's the Anglican church. You see this line here, that's Cross Highway. So in the present day you're looking at, say, like Old Reading Road to Diamond Hill to Great Pasture, to, Cross Highway, and then on to
that was the defining line. That was the defining line between Fairfield and this whole area up in here was undivided lands. And the town first became a parish in 1729, and then it became a town in 1767.
So that's the thing. So basically, this is called by different historians either the oblong or the peculiar, because what you have down here is what was called the Fairfield Longmonths. So we all thought, because this is Danbury, Bethel right here, so they all thought until 1709 that we owned up to here. So this goes all the way to Fairfield to the shore. And long lines were like a lot of long lots that different families own. But
we'll get to them there, because you see the long
you'll
lots
see it there.
right
But what I was saying, what's important to know is that when they surveyed it in 1709, this was all open space. So this was unclaimed land. So that's when the fun started. So that's where this map comes into play, because all these guys here, for the most part, are Anglicans.
Well, up in the upper part?
Yeah. So these are mostly Anglicans, and the red line is,
Look from Cross Highway to what is today the Bethel border. There's basically 9 plots of land that were in there, and those lands were claimed by different settlers with no deeds. They just laid out their own pieces of land and built their own houses and stuff. And then a few years went by in they started around late 1600s, but really in the early 1700s, until about 1714 or so, there's enough settlers in there that decided maybe we should have titles to these lands. So the way that they got titles is they found a few indigenous people who weren't necessarily totally on the up and up. They were just willing to take whatever, they were willing to put their little X's on property deeds. The English love having property deeds. They wanted to be sure that they own the lands. The indigenous people, if they gave them a few dollars, in case of...
You got that in the slide here.
Yeah, they gave them a few dollars, promised to build a house. Even the way this was done, this was the 1714 deed from Sam Mohawk, who was also known as Chickens, to John Reed. And it doesn't even just totally demark where the land is, okay, or how big the piece of land is. It just says John Reed's manor. And even the language that John Reed uses in this it's a little on the sarcastic side. He calls himself Lord Justice and Sovereign Pontiff. I'm really sure the Chickens knew what a pontiff was.
And that's the thing, like, it turns out to be like roughly 500 acres for £3 and a promise of a house in the following autumn.
Yeah, and the indigenous people didn't really understand land ownership the way the English did. And land ownership, they all used the land, and they used portions of it that they grew crops with during the summertime, and other portions that they hunted on, and places that they lived. They just thought the land was all theirs. They didn't understand a lot of the deeds, some of the original deeds, they didn't specifically say that they could still use the lands. The later deeds actually said that they could still hunt and grow crops and stuff on the lands.
Because that's just how they worked, like different Indian tribes or people or friends could, somebody could hunt pheasant or fowl, and somebody could fish, and someone could farm on it. And that's, we saw that dating back into the Umpqua deed, and that was in 1686. And they, in that deed, said that they wanted half Umpqua Pond. Obviously, that was probably a big popular fishing place. So they were somewhat aware of it, but they weren't aware of what was going to happen next. And a lot of times they would make these deeds, and then 20, 30 years later, they'd be kicked out. And you got to think about it in terms of 20, 30 years. And so that was a big problem in the time frame. So we get into what the farms were.
Right, the typical farms. And the typical farms that were built in the long lots, those were very narrow lots. They were given to the 100 highest taxpayers in the town of Fairfield. They were anywhere from about 60 feet wide to about, I think the widest one was 600 feet wide, but most of them were in the 250, 300 foot wide. But they were 10 miles deep. So they weren't really usable pieces of land the way they were. And throughout the next 100, 150 years, you see so many land transfers as people would pick one piece of land in their long lot, and then they would buy adjoining pieces to make a contiguous farm so that they could actually farm the thing. Most of those farms, the original farms, were 10 to 40 acres. The lots of the farms that were north of Cross Highway, those 9 original parcels, they were much larger. They were 400 or 500 to 600 acres. But these were all self-subsistent farms. Most of the farmers, they raised cattle, hogs, chickens for food. They had hens for laying eggs, had at least one milk cow, and several sheep for wool. They grew crops of corn, potatoes, wheat, barley, and oats. Again, it was only for themselves. At that particular point, they weren't looking to have crops that they could sell or trade for other people.
Yeah, they couldn't go to Carluzzi's. But what I love about the photos, this is actually, I've been at his house. Dennis Paget did the famous people who lived in Redding, Connecticut, and that was his house. I was able to,
This is on Rock House Road.
Yeah.
This is a beach farm.
Right.
It's actually in the town of Easton.
I thought it was instead.
No.
Well, his house was just like this.
Most of these houses look pretty nice.
This is the most rabbit hole that we get together offline. The whole smoking thing, because I really didn't think about that, but you brought it up. It's wild.
You couldn't eat, if you butchered a cow, you couldn't eat the cow until before the meat went bad. They had no refrigeration. So what they did is they either salted beef which dried it out, and then they would have to rehydrate it before when they cooked it, or they smoked it. And smoking, one good thing about smoking is it added a nice flavor to it. The salt did not add a nice flavor to it. That's one of the reasons we did so much business with the West Indies is with so many spices and stuff, because they had to add all the spices to salted meats and stuff like that when they rehydrated them, so they were palatable. Otherwise, I mean, all you got was a taste of salt. So to preserve fish, fowl, beef, venison, pork, and mutton, they did a lot of times they smoked it. And a lot of the early farms had smokehouses on them. And then the meat and the fish and the fowl, they could be kept for long periods of time. You know, you didn't have to consume it right away. Because some of that stuff you could keep for, well, especially the salted stuff. I mean,
They said like 2 years, which is crazy.
it was kind of like fruitcakes.
Yeah, no, it was wild. And if they didn't have a smokehouse, then you know, they had like a corner of the chimney flue that was kind of like a meat closet for smoking. That was the other thing too that we really found interesting was, you know, this, my grandfather always talked about, you know, the root cellar, because he grew up in Georgetown. This happened up until probably refrigeration, but, you know, this
We had
is-
root cellars in the 40s and the 50s. I mean,
This
still a
is-
lot of houses still
yep.
used them.
This house did it.
I looked try to get a good picture for this, and this is not a particularly good picture because it's got a window in it, and it's really, most root cellars did not have a window in it, because the whole purpose of having a root cellar was to try to keep the temperature fairly even. So it was generally around low 50s, mid 50s, because it was underground. And if you put a window in it, you would get the really cold air come in the wintertime, and the sunlight would heat it in the summertime. But at least this, a lot of them I looked at, you couldn't see the stuff that was in the root cellars. But they would grew crops that, particularly the root cellar root crops like potatoes, carrots, yams, that type of stuff, that would keep for a long period of time. Well, most of the farmers, you know, they had apple orchards because apples kept for a long period of time and for a fruit. So they could, and then they would also make cheese, and cheese they keep in the root cellar because it was cool enough so it would stay for a long time before it would get moldy. And they could also put a lot of the cured meats and stuff in there too. So it was kind of their refrigeration, but it really wasn't that cool.
Yeah, and some even like did layers of sand. And my grandfather always talked about moving around the different layers, you know, that were within the sand to keep it.
They used sand and they used a lot of straw too. The straw was pretty easy. But one thing you couldn't do is you didn't want to have an apple and bruise it and then leave it in with the other apples because then they would all rot. So they had to be very careful about how they stored everything.
And a lot of the work, you know, that's being done is being done by the kids.
Yeah.
You know, that was part of the thing. So the layout, Bruce did a nice job. So this is actually a house in Easton, right?
Yeah, this is the beach house that I showed earlier. That's this house. This was done in 1937. Radio personality by the name of Jane. The name just
Say you didn't prepare, man.
I prepared. I'm old. My memory's not that good. All right. But the typical house was. The typical early houses, even though when we look at a lot of the Redding houses that are from the 1700s, they're quite large. Some of them have been added on to. They're also the ones that survived were a lot of ones that came from wealthier families, so they did survive. A lot of the earlier houses generally were salt box houses. They were generally in the 9 to 1,200 square foot range, and that was for one reason only, and that was so that you could live in them in the wintertime because you couldn't heat a bigger house than that. They would build a stone chimney in the center, would usually start in the basement and go right up through the top. The main floor would usually have 3 fireplaces, there were usually 3 main rooms on the main floor. The biggest one being the keeping room, and that would be the room where they would do all the cooking. And then there was 2 other rooms, sometimes a parlor, and then sometimes what they would call a birthing room. And the birthing room would be when someone had a child, they would stay in that room for the first winter or 2 because a baby needed to be warmer than the kids. Most of the older kids would sleep upstairs. There was no heat upstairs, generally speaking, in most of these houses. Just the heat rose, and the center chimney, because there was a fire going in for the entire winter time, got warm, and it radiated heat, so that it would stay warm enough. Almost all these houses could be much, if they've survived, they've got to put a lot of additions and stuff on.
Yeah, the sleeping loft, that's what we call it. This was the best that he found, was that they would go through 30 to 40 cords of wood a year. That's a lot.
Yeah, you think about it, because you needed at least 20 cords just to heat these small houses, but then they had a fire going all year long for cooking. You know, you wouldn't want to put, they wouldn't put the fire out at all. I mean, it would just continue to go. So 30 to 40 cords of wood. Now think about that with the fact that you don't have any chainsaws. You know, wood is being cut, the trees are being generally felled with axes or a cross-cut saw with 2 men working on it. And then you've got to cut it all up and you've got to split it by hand, no log splitters. So to come up with that much wood, we've got some diaries, even from the 1800s, where people would work for as long as 3 or 4 weeks during the summer just to take in enough wood for the winter time. So and it just, when I stuck with 3 or 4 weeks, they worked 3 or 4 weeks solid, all day long for 3 or 4 weeks to bring in enough wood. And a cord of wood, not a cord of wood, but the 30 to 40 cords of wood would take about 1 full acre of medium growth trees to do. So that's why a lot of, when you see a lot of the probate deeds and probate wills, when someone died, you'd see there'd be a wood lot. And it wouldn't necessarily be contingent to the property that it was on. It might be a mile away or 2 miles away or something like that. But that's all they did, is they grew trees there just to cut for firewood.
Yep. And that's the whole thing with the long lots was, the idea early on in Fairfield from the shore up was to give them a bunch of land that went all the way up so they could get a little bit of all the benefits of that land. You know, because mostly everyone was just in Fairfield.
They also didn't know what to do with it.
Well, yeah, but still, like, you know, they want to get big chunks of somebody, like, you know, with a bunch of like granite rock, and some people got really nice farms, so that was, that they gave them a little bit of everything. And, you know, firewood was, as you say, like, it was very, very important in that time frame. There was no other heat. This one's neat too, because, you know, a lot of old houses, you'll find those narrow staircases that are hidden within the buildings, and that's why they're there. When I lived in a house up in Lime Rock, had this same thing, but you can make a good point.
Right, and look at the way these stairs are built.
Yeah.
I mean, today the stairs have to be, there's a certain rise and a certain depth. This rise is, each one of these stairs is a little bit different. This is not a staircase you want to run up and down in the dark. You know, and they were very steep, because they did, again, the houses were very small inside. They wanted to take up as little space as possible in the staircase. The ceilings were very low. Somebody like me, I can go into some of these houses and my head hits the ceiling. A lot of times I have to bend and go through the doorways. The ceilings were low because that held heat in, so it was easier to heat the house that way. You'll see, when you see, I like this particular picture because it's got some pottery or stoneware or china or whatever you want to call it. And a lot of these houses, particularly in the early 1700s, those items would have been brought from Europe, when they came from Europe. So they were prized possessions because they weren't available here at that particular time.
Yeah. Ox carts, your ox cart paths. Every time I come back home, I realize that they're old ox cart paths that are just paved. I came across some Danbury, so I was like, oh my god. But then when they talk about ox cart paths, they're just about the size of the back of like 2 oxen. But the oxen were very important to the earlier settlers because obviously they're stronger than the horses. They require less food. They're very strong. They use them not only for just traveling around, but removing stumps.
Moving the stones.
Like they were the ultimate utility vehicle.
Yeah, and then when you see these ox carts, one of the things you see that they got really big wheels, and the really big wheels made it really easier for them to get around because there weren't a lot of roads. There was a lot of areas that were kind of cleared. You know, it's an ox path, a lot of them cow paths. They really weren't cleared, so they had rocks. They had to go over the rocks. Smaller wheels won't go over the rocks. Mud in the springtime, once the snow's melted, smaller wheels would get easily stuck. The bigger wheels would roll through them.
Yeah, and that's why you see the oxen in so many older stories about the revolutionary time frame, because they were the what we now call a workhorse. They were the workhorse, and that's their.
But going through some of the earliest census, I think most people think that most farmers had a lot of horses, and the horses did the work. most farmers had at least 2 oxen, some of them 4. Most farmers had 1 horse, sometimes 2. Horses were expensive and they were harder to, it cost more to feed. They wouldn't just eat hay. You had to give them oats and other things.
Right.
Stone walls.
Stone walls, yes.
Redding's full of stone walls. Never walked through the woods. I remember many times you have young people asking, why did they build these stone walls in the woods? Well, they didn't. Stone walls. Those at one time were cleared fields. And the stone walls were difficult to make. Brent and I always get sucked into the elephant wall of the street. Okay? And the elephant wall is so wide for one reason. Look at the rocks. They're huge rocks. A 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot boulder, a round boulder, weighs approximately 1,800 to 2,200 pounds, depending on the rock. So when you have stuff like that, you can't stack them. You can have the ox pull them, move them, and put them side by side. But when you look at a wall like that, and there's a wall like that off of Diamond Hill, and I'm trying to think what the name of the trail that goes into Stormfield is, from right in the corner of Foxborough.
Raccoon Lane.
Stormfield?
Raccoon Lane.
Raccoon Lane, that's it, okay. But that's also got a wall that's built like that. There's a wall like that on Route 58, just by the eastern town line. There's a bunch of them like that. But it's that they're not elephant walls. They're just walls where they got big stones and they had to make them wide and to do anything else.
And even like when you were clearing the land, like the Frosties would bring up more stone, so it was like a never-ending
Connecticut
process.
potatoes.
Yeah. So we didn't have really great land for farming. That's why you see probably one of our most popular crops in that time frame is onions.
Yeah, because you didn't have to plant it very deep.
Right. Oh, the other thing too is like, there's more than just stone walls, but they used to, like, there was cow pounds or cattle pounds for livestock. So they would build these rectangular or square pounds with stone. And so when your cow was lost, it would be brought into the cow pound and held there.
Every town had one in the center of town, where if you found a lost cow and it didn't belong to you, and you were honest, you brought them there, and that's where the people found their wayward animals.
And there was fines for that, and there was cow pound managers, and if you didn't come in time, your cow was auctioned off. It's a really neat topic. You should Google it. Schools. So we only had 3. As we started, we were looking, probably things start to really, percolate in town around the late 1730s. So we only had 3 districts in town because obviously the population was a lot less. So you had one of them in the Ridge area, probably down by Poverty Hollow. They said west of the Aspetuck. They had one in what we now know around the corner as the area around the Redding Roadhouse. And then there was another one up in Redding Center. What was neat was that these 3 districts were split up in 5 months in the Ridge, 5 months here around the corner, and then only 2 months in the center.
Yeah.
Which was really surprising because you think there'd be more time in the center because you think there'd be more people here.
Well, all of it. The town was pretty much divided by the 3 rivers in town: the Aspetuck, the Little River, and the Saugatuck. And you had most of the people they settled. The initial settlers that wanted to farm generally settled in the higher country, because the higher country was a little bit easier to clean off. The river valleys were full of rocks. They didn't have. There was a couple of areas there was enough silt and stuff like that they could grow crops. But most of the time they raised on the ridges. So you had Alpawag, Lonetown, and Chestnut Ridge, which is now Redding Ridge.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that you come to think of is that what we now know as a reservoir was actually farmland. And you kind of see that when the water goes down enough to see all the stone walls and the foundation. So there's a lot more people down here in this region in that time frame that we don't really think about because the water covers it up.
But by 1768, we ended up with 7 school districts. And then we get into the 1800s, we had as many as 13 school districts. What they try to do is make the schools close enough for the kids to be able to walk. There was no way to get the kids to school other than the kids would have to walk there. So if they had to walk 3 or 4 miles, they didn't get a lot of attendance to these schools. The state or even the colonial government required that the towns provide free education for children between the ages of 5 and 12. They didn't mandate that children go to school, but most people wanted their kids to at least learn how to read and write and do some math. But school population and school attendance grew considerably as the schools became closer together. When they were first, again, if you had a 5-year-old kid and he had to walk 4 miles to school, he probably didn't go to school.
Yeah.
You wouldn't if it was my kid.
So now we get into, 1775 is when things really start to come into a bit of change for us, not only just Reading, but Connecticut and the rest of the country. Religion is a big part, as we mentioned in the beginning, of life here in Reading. Nathaniel Bartlett was...
He was the second minister, but he was a minister for 57 years. John Beach, who was a minister at the Anglican Church, he was also a minister for around 50 years. So
yeah, 49 or 50 years.
Very long period of time.
So, Bartlett he's over on 10 Cross Highway.
But these were generally the most learned men in town, because most of these guys most of them went to Yale. Yale's school of divinity. And it said they would have been the wisest people, and initially they were some of the people that did the teaching before they actually built the schools, is they actually taught in the church meeting house. But Reverend Bartlett was very much for independence from Great Britain. So much so that at one time, he lived like 10 Cross Highway, his house is still standing, right? And in that house, they found a good-sized cache of gunpowder that he had stored for the militia in town.
Yep, and that's the thing, when you were getting news in that time frame, it was from either the local tavern, which wasn't like the Roadhouse. That was kind of the place where you got your mail, everything, you got your food, or you got it, on Sunday morning.
It always amazes me how anybody in town got mail, because there was no post office. The first post office in Reading was at the United States Post Office was in 1811, was the first postmaster in Reading, even though the post office was established in 1775. But before that, all the mail was delivered by post riders, and it was only delivered to taverns. It wasn't delivered to, there was no mail, no post offices whatsoever. So you could take probably 3 or 4 months to get a letter. And I don't know which tavern they decided to leave it at.
Yeah.
It would just have the town's name, and there could be 3 or 4 taverns.
Main highways, yeah, post riders were basically like the Pony Express, but just way back in that time frame. So John Beach lived on Reading Ridge, he was, it's interesting, a lot of these Anglicans were originally Presbyterians that converted. He is one of them. So he converted to Anglican, and he not only taught here in Reading, but also in Newtown. And a lot of the knowledge came from churches that started in Stratford, Connecticut. So we are blessed in Reading with 2 different religions. And in this time period, most of us here in Reading get along. And that's kind of what Bruce kind of shares is, they lived in harmony for the most part. They respected each other. Obviously, the Presbyterians were the ones who had the first town meeting house, but they said that in their opening statement, if you will, that even if you were the Church of England, you're welcome to come here.
There's a little bit of exaggeration in here. John Beach is talking about that his church was increasing at more than 20 to 1.
Yeah.
It sounds like a modern politician as far as stretching the truth on the thing. But the thing is, they made it, this sounds a little sarcastic in a way, but they really did live in harmony, but they didn't trust each other. So you had people on the ridge, most of the people on the ridge were loyalists for the most part. Most of the people that lived in the center part of the town and went to the Presbyterian Congregational Church wanted independence. So he said there was definitely 2 different sides, but they they did manage to get along, even throughout most of the war. There was a few of them. There was John Lyons, who lived right next to the church, the Anglican church. He was very much an outspoken loyalist, and he actually went and fought for the British. And
you're kind of getting ahead of yourself with that, because what's really neat about that story is that Lyons lived in John Beach's house.
Not John Beach's house.
John Beach lived, well, Herod moved him to both. So we were getting ahead of the story, because John Beach used to live in John Lyons' house, which became Heron's house, before he moved to Newtown completely.
I never knew he lived in Redding.
Yeah, he did. But no, just to settle back like this, so this is the after the completion of the meeting house, which was basically the whole house for the town in the center, they stated to everyone in town, all those persons that inhabit or hereby may inhabit this parish, which profess themselves to be of the Church of England, shall have free liberty to come into this meeting house and attend public worship of God according to the articles of the divine of the Saybrook and established by the laws of the government. So they were just kind of extending an olive branch, if you will. But things all changed February of 1775.
I'm just curious, how many people immigrated directly from England, or how many are from other parts? You know, like how everybody came from Salem, and then from Salem, people moved away.
The vast majority of the people, original people, like I said, the vast majority, particularly the ones in the long lots, came from Fairfield. They were members of the Fairfield families that owned some of the long lots, the children and grandchildren. They came up here and started to settle. And then there was quite a few people that moved here some from Ireland, some from England, but those were about the only two places that during that particular time that people were coming from.
And above, like Cross Highway, where the Anglicans were, like for instance, like the original John Reed came from New Milford, and others came from Stratford. So, you know, in the early 1700s is where Stratford was kind of the stronghold for Anglicanism, and then they were allowed to practice their religion, and then they kind of made their way from there to here. So a lot of those guys were from Stratford. But like I said, this was a game changer. So in February 1775, the loyalists in town decide to state that they are with England, and they are staunch supporters of not going into rebellion. And I think we read from the historian Charles Burrell Todd that that was like a red flag to a bull.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, there's 141 people that signed this document, the Reading Royalist Association. And the amazing thing is, this is in 1775. By 2 years later, you find that probably a third of those people were either fighting with the militia or with the Continental Army. They changed sides. There was a lot of ambivalence in Reading. And you got to think about it. If you're a subsistence farmer, you really don't give a who's running the federal government, because the federal government really wasn't doing anything for you at that particular time. They provided you with a little bit of protection against the French and the Indians. They had done that. But other than that, everybody was just pretty much looking out for each other. So there wasn't, most people, they didn't really care one way or the other.
Yeah, but the thing that came after this was that really kind of changed things was that the individuals assigned it in town, Reading. There was 42 landholders, so those were the guys that were important. They actually owned property. So there was a group of the Patriots or Independents, if you will, and they published everyone's name. So now everyone in town knew exactly who signed this proclamation and who was against, going into rebellion. And then a lot of them were harassed so badly that basically by the end of the year, they mostly signed an agreement saying that we're not going to support anyone that goes the other side. We're not going to take arms against anyone who rebels. And so they kind of stand down. And even John Beach himself, the Reverend of the Anglican Church, did that.
Well, you can see where this was published. This was published in New York. you know, because there was no local newspapers, and when it was published, probably nobody even saw it for at least 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, because it would take that long before the newspapers would get to the taverns and stuff here. And this, I find this is interesting just because a lot of these original 13 colonies were nowhere near as large as they are today. They all ended at the proclamation line, which was established at the Treaty of Paris in 1763. But when we declared independence, the population in Connecticut was 206,000, the population in Reading was 1,260. So there weren't a lot of people.
No, and all of this is basically land that's either French or Indian.
All right, this is the first time that we really see the British in Reading. Actually, it's the only time we see the British in Reading. It was in April of 1777. The British landed, I don't know how many ships, but they landed at Campo Beach, and Campo Beach then was still part of Fairfield. But there was 2,000 soldiers. They debarked the ships around 8, 9 o'clock in the evening on Friday evening, and they marched and they camped late Friday evening into early Saturday morning, right around the present Fairfield eastern border on Reading Road. And then they got up the next morning and they marched northward towards Danbury. The goal was to go, Danbury had a bunch of storehouses that had a lot of materials in them. The goal was to raid them. It wasn't to burn them. But they did not bring horses and wagons. They thought that there was enough loyalists in the area that they could command the horses and wagons and they could load them up and bring them back to the ships at Campo. They were greatly mistaken on that because most of the teamsters who had wagons heard that they were coming. They loaded their horses or pushed the horses to their wagons and they headed north to the Milford. So that when the British finally got to Danbury, they found out there was no way to move the materials back to Westport. So their plan completely changed. But anyway, they're going through Reading. They got up in the morning on Saturday and they marched up. They run into a small contingent of people on Jump Hill,
Which is next to like the Connecticut Golf Club.
right there. They surprised those guys. They took some of them prisoners and disarmed them. And then they ended up and they get to Reading about 10:30 in the morning, and they decided to have their noonday meal. So the British generals, Tryon, Erskine, and Agnew, all go to this man's house right next to the church, William Heron, and he serves them wine and cakes for lunch and has a nice discussion with them. Acts like he's a good friend of theirs. And from there they went on and got to Danbury early that evening. By the time I think it was raining pretty hard by the time they got there. But then 6 or 7 hours later, the Continental Army, with their armed generals come. They have 500 militiamen and about 100 regular members of the Continental Army. And their General Silliman, Arnold, and Worcester, they come along, chasing the British, following the British, and they stop at William Heron's house. And he entertains them with cake and wine.
That's the thing, and we don't learn this until 100 years later. He was a double agent spy. Why wouldn't you be in that time frame? Because you know which side's going to win.
He played both sides against the middle. He was from Cork, Ireland. And we don't know a lot about him. He taught for a little while in Greenfield Hill before he ended up coming to Reading. And then he ended up buying one of the houses that had been confiscated from Lyon's house, and that's where he lived. But he was the ultimate, double agent. He regularly went from Reading and sailed across to Long Island where the British were. Just put a white flag on the boat that they went on and went back and forth, and nobody bothered him for the entire war.
He got a free ticket from the Governor Trumbull. Like he was allowed to do that. So he was coming from friendly territory in Long Island into the city. So. But the crazy thing about him is that he's right next to the Anglican church, living in the Anglican church reverend's old house, and then right across the way is Stephen Betts, who's running the show for the revolutionaries in Reading as they enter the encampments.
Yeah, General Parsons stayed in Stephen Betts' tavern for 2 years.
Yeah, Betts and then Parsons right there. So he knew everything that was going on.
Well, where did the 500 militiamen come from? Where were they?
They were locals. They were locals. They had picked them up along the
Along the
way.
way.
Some of them from Reading. Reading. There was one regiment in Reading that had there was 92 men in it. It was run by Ezekiel Sanford, and 12 of those men were from Reading, and they ended up fighting in the Battle of Richfield on Sunday, and 2 of them I think were wounded.
No, the British were really, really intelligent, because what they did was, Silliman was in Fairfield, so he thinks they're coming for him. So they land in Combo Beach, Westport. So he crawls, "Hey everybody, I need help, they're coming to get me," because he thinks that he's coming up. So everyone, even in from Bethel and Danbury, go to Fairfield. So that's why we're so far behind, because he thought they were coming after him, but no. But it was a very brilliant plan by the British, and then they were led by loyalists that lived in the area, so they knew all the back roads and the ways to go. So
Well, they chose to come up Black Rock Turnpike for one particular reason. There was only one river crossing between Campo Beach and Danbury, one major river crossing. So there was, and that's the Aspetuck, right where the Bluebird is today. So I said that was probably the way they were planning on coming back once they loaded the wagons. But when there were no wagons, and they had to burn everything that was in Danbury, and they found out that there was a bunch of militiamen and the Continental Army coming after them, they decided they'd take a different route, so they ended up going through Richmond.
yeah, Westport Historical did a great book. It's called "The Bridge Not Taken." Benedict Arnold outwitted.
In the 80s, I lived in Weston, and on Ladder Hill Road, which is right off 53, 57, Reading Road, Weston Road that comes all the way up. They found a cannonball. So there was all this discussion that they thought that was the route, that they came right up through the middle of Weston.
They came back, so they used a very unknown ford that only the locals will know. So the Bridge Not Taken was this major, like you said, across the river.
If you look at this map that's up here now, this shows the route that they took.
It's way over that.
The British traveled with map makers, so that they made a map while they were going along. So the British kept very, very meticulous records of everything they did. They were a completely organized army. They were not like the militia and the Continental Army, which was just kind of thrown together. When they had the Battle of Richfield, the British lost 26, were killed, 117 wounded, and 29 missing, and Americans lost 20, and about 40 to 80 people were wounded. Again, Americans didn't keep really good records. The British had perfect records of the thing. But considering the sizes of the armies, it looks like the British fared a little bit better than the Americans did, because we were outnumbered at least 2-1 by the time the Battle of Richmond
They're more organized too. Yeah.
And then some of the men and boys that they captured, that Tryon took on his way to Danbury, he brought them back to Campo. He released some of them at Campo, took some of the other ones, particularly the boys. Tryon had this thing about boys, that he thought boys would grow into men and they would become soldiers and they would want to fight him. So he wanted to make sure that they didn't grow into men. So he took them back, and they kept some of them in sugar houses and some of them in prisoner ships.
And then fed them smallpox.
I think 2 of the Reading boys ended up dying in the sugar houses.
See, that's why, so if you go down Topstone, there's Jeremiah Sanford Road, and so Jeremiah Sanford was 19 years old. He died in one of these prisons.
And this shows you how long news takes to travel. This is the London Gazette in late June of 1777, 2 months after the raid on Danbury. And this lists the raid on Danbury and how much stuff was lost. It was 4,000 pounds 4,000 barrels rather of pork and beef, 1,000 pounds of flour, about 1,000 tents, and 5,000 pairs of boots and stockings. But they kept real good records of every place where they went and where they got the stuff and what they did with it. This is amazing, because throughout the Revolutionary War, the federal governments and the states needed to pay for supplies and other things. And they had no gold, they had no silver, so there was no specie to back up. So what they did is they printed currency, but the currency, when you read the currency, it's not payable for either 2 or 4 years. They're basically IOUs. So they became basically valueless. What took in 1775 one continental dollar to buy, by 1781 took 167 continental dollars. And it was one of the phrases they called, it was worthless as a continental. So most of Redding's farmers, most of the people who lived in Redding, they wanted to barter. They didn't want anything to do with this money. So when the Continental Army came here in 1778, the winter of 1778, they were only paying the sawmills and the workers in continental dollars. So they didn't have a bunch of people in Redding that were real happy to see them. Because they weren't getting any money. This just gives you an idea of what a meeting house would have looked like for the Presbyterian and the congregation before they actually built churches. The wealthiest people would have sat in the boxes down on the main floor. But during this particular time, when anyone was assigned to go into the army and was away, volunteers or people were selected from the town selectmen to help the families farm the farmers. Because if you took a 30-year-old farmer, he might have had some children, but his children were 6, 7, 8, 9 years old maybe. He really couldn't farm his land, his wife couldn't farm the land. So other farmers would step in and help them. And that's what they did throughout the entire period of the war.
So this is where we come into the revolution. Redding selected as a place where we're going to not only have what we now know as Putnam Park, but we're going to have 3 encampments. And the idea around that was that the British are in New York and the French are coming in. They're up in Rhode Island. So they kind of form a crescent around from the Hudson to the Sound to protect not only the French, but also areas like West Point and Danbury, so they can't be destroyed again. So
and this was a winter encampment, and back in the day, they didn't fight wars during the winter time. It was just too difficult to move around. So basically, everybody took the winter off. So wherever they were at the end of November, they just pretty much built encampments and stayed there. And they had some skirmishes, but there were no major battles during the winter. But this is this picture was taken when they first made Putnam Park. This is from 1880, 1882 or something like that. But they built, just at Putnam Park, they built 116 huts. Each one of these huts, there was a fireplace on one end and a door on the other end. I don't know that there was windows in it like they built the windows. Because when I read when General Parsons described that the huts that they were building, I didn't see anything about windows, and it wouldn't have made sense to put a window in there because it lets cold air in. So it wouldn't have really made a whole, to have a door and a fireplace on the other end. So you can just imagine how much clear cutting they had to do to build this many huts. This was just one of 3 encampments. So each one of these encampments all had 100+ huts. You had one that was off of Waterbury Lane and one off of Old Lantern Road, right on the Redding Danbury town line, plus the one where Putnam Park is today.
yeah, they cut down all the trees, stonework, in a winter that was pretty much probably somewhat similar to this.
Yeah, they didn't really start building much of this until late November. They were still building huts in late December and early January. And it's really interesting when you can find one of these journals from one of these soldiers. This is from Private Joseph Martin, and he was at Parsons Middle Encampment. And he talks about how miserable the weather was, like we were talking about today. And, that they didn't have very much in the way of blankets, and they wouldn't have a lot of food. And the probably ironic thing is by now, the Danbury storehouses have been rebuilt. The Danbury storehouses had a lot of the things that they needed to have in Redding that winter, but the winter was so bad that the Teamsters couldn't move the materials. So, it made it really very difficult for the soldiers that were here. And so General Poor's group, there was 500 or 600 guys in that group, and I think they said 300 or 400 of them had no stockings or footwear. All he did was have whatever cloth they could wrap around their feet to try to keep it warm. I can't believe that they didn't all lose Digits from frostbite.
And like, you know, unless you have a hot tub, don't try it. I did it once, bad idea. Took a lot of hours by the wood stove to thaw out my toes. But yeah, they were definitely made different back then. But that was the thing. There, you know, in the early on, there were a lot of they wanted to rebel. So there was a lot of notes back and forth between Hartford and also Washington himself that says, you know, enough is enough. We're just going to leave. So that's where, you know, you learn about the executions and General Putnam and what was going on. There was a lot of different things going on. There was just a lot of bad behavior. You didn't have any food, so there's farmers around you. You steal a pig, you steal a hen. You know, you're hungry, and so there was a lot of need to get things back to normal. So
the Reading farmers were particularly unhappy, particularly the ones who were closest to the camps, because they were losing hogs, chickens, and cows on a regular basis, because these guys were starving to death. I mean, they were basically eating bread and a little hardtack. I mean, they weren't getting much of the way of food.
And then certain soldiers were going back and forth across the lines, sharing information about what was going on in Reading. So Putnam had to find a way to bring order back to the army. So that's where the story of the executions on Gallows Hill.
Yeah, he decided to make an example of two young men. One was Edward Jones, who was arrested and charged with spying, and the other was Private John Smith. Smith and Jones, I mean, just, you know, really typical names, I guess. You know, and he was charged with desertion. Both men were court-martialed on February 4th and scheduled for execution on February 6th. So he didn't give them a lot of time. And one thing that Putnam really wanted to do is he wanted every single one of the soldiers to witness these executions as an example of what would happen to you if you disobeyed orders and you acted up. So they had all 3,000 plus soldiers show up at the middle encampment on Gallows Hill, and that's why, in that area, that's why they call it Gallows Hill, is because they built a gallows there, and that was for Edward Jones. And they, just to make it interesting, they decided to have a firing squad for John Smith. So, and Putnam was not exactly, you know, the kindest person in the world, because what he did is he chose two 12-year-old boys from Reading to work the gallows, and they refused. So finally, they had to use soldiers to work the gallows, and when the firing squad, there was 3 men in the firing squad, and they shot 3 bullets into Smith, and Smith lay on the ground, and they shot another one into his chest while he was laying on the ground, and then put one through his forehead. And the one on his chest set him on fire because of the powder burns on the thing, set it on fire, and they just let him burn, and they walked every single soldier by them. So it definitely made an impression, I guess, in the soldier. They had no problems.
You know, it worked. You know, I think they didn't really have as many issues from that point forward, but it's not like it didn't take a toll. To be honest with you, just months later, Israel Putnam suffers a stroke, and he's out of the military. So you kind of, it's a telltale of there must have been some stress within him as well to have that happen to him. But yeah, things did improve for the American Army from that point forward. But they improved for other soldiers too who got married while they were here.
Yeah, the Reverend Bartlett, he married at least 7 couples. There were 7 soldiers with 7 brides from Reading. So there was a little bit of romance. So it wasn't all horrible. And of course, we don't know if it was love or pregnancy.
But they had a lot of balls. They had a lot of gatherings. So the locals really did get to know the soldiers as well.
So one of the interesting things is William Grumman, who lived right up the street here.
Yeah, just up the hill.
Just up the hill.
We're generous.
Yeah, he wrote a book in about 1880, and he documented every single Reading soldier and everybody that participated that he could in the war, and it's a pretty interesting book. But there was 133 men that were enlisted in the military, either in the militia or in the Continental Army from Reading, and it was a like amount of men that also were teamsters that moved materials and people that worked in the sawmills and stuff like that. But if you add it all up, the number of people that fought in the revolution and the number of people that wanted to remain loyal to the king, there were fairly equal numbers throughout the entire war.
And that's the thing, like, and that's why I think it's important that we keep this out celebrating it this way, because really America changed here, you know, right here in our town. To have 3 encampments in that time period when the war was changing. Once the French came in, everything really started to change. They had a navy, they had soldiers, they had gunpowder. Gunpowder was not really readily available until the French come in to help us. But, you know, really Connecticut Valley Forge, if you will. So that's something to be proud of, and you know, that middle encampment is probably the best preserved Revolutionary War encampment in the entire country. And that's been protected through a lot of love from a lot of people, especially, you know, the land trust in the towns. So, you know, that's why, you know, we're going to continue to share the story of America. Now, you know, we just gave you kind of the beginnings of what was going on. Well, we're going to continue and talk about other topics that are of interest, like Charles Ives. Charles Ives lives right up the hill. That's the next adventure. Sean's leading that effort, and we're going to be a part of
Sean
that.
would come up. Sean is leading the effort. We're going to hopefully culminate this. We're going to have 3 talks, and then we're going to culminate this effort with a concert at Joe Barlow by the Bridgeport Symphony Orchestra, which will play Charles Ives music. And one of those pieces is 3 pieces in 3 places in New England, and one of the middle piece of that is about Putnam Park. So he said, Sean will tell us, we need sponsors.
Yeah. This is what we're hoping to do. I'm Sean McNamara, Redding Nursery. I usually talk to plants, so it's unusual for some people, but it's so amazing. I grew up in Redding. It's so amazing to have all these people come out to hear about the history of Redding. And we're so lucky to have 2 amazing historians, so thank you guys for that. So a bunch of us were thinking, you know, what everybody's celebrating America 250, and Reading's a very special place. What could we do to do it? And I was like, well, I'm a musician, so I thought, well, it'd be fun to have the high school band play some patriotic music, concert in the green. That would be wonderful. But then I thought, this is such an amazing town. About a mile up the road, Mark Twain Library. Mark Twain is there, one of the greatest Americans ever. And a mile and a half up the road, Charles Ives, who I don't know how well people can appreciate how he changed music in the 20th century. And we're so blessed to have him here. I mean, his name is everywhere. It's the Ives Center, we've got Ives Bank. But I don't know how many people have ever gone to see an Ives concert. I was in Carnegie Hall, was walking around the back, and there's a picture of Charles Ives and a letter that he wrote. He is I think, in some ways, an unappreciated master of music. And so I thought, well, wouldn't it be great to have Charles Ives music played here in Reading, especially when this piece that he did that is Putnam's Camp. So I thought, well, that would be great. But the problem is, the music is so complicated, there's no way that a high school band could play it. So I went and I met with Chris Bro, who's the director, and he's a huge fan of Ives. And so we thought, what if we brought in a symphony to play with the kids, and play not only the Ives piece, but also some patriotic music, bring everybody together, and celebrate this amazing country and this amazing town. So, I just happened to be playing with my friend Jason's back there. Jason and I were playing golf, and I was, calling around to the WestCon trying to find a band that would be able to play a symphony. And we just happened to be playing with a board member from the Greater Bridgeport Symphony Orchestra, and I was like, this is serendipitous. So we started talking. One of the Bridgeport Symphony, one of their major missions is outreach to kids, to a lot of the schools. They do a lot of work with the schools down in Bridgeport, Fairfield, and that area. So this was like, well, that's what we do. Let's make it happen. So how do we make it happen? It's going to cost some money to bring them in. The plan is to have the concert on May 30th. The school is all set, they're all on board. So we needed to start to look for money. So I've been looking around. Unfortunately, I've been going to the banks. I've heard, oh, banks will help out with community events like that. And everybody said it's great. Problem is, everybody's trying to do America 250 right now, so it's slim pickings. So what we're hoping to do is get a little bit of money that way. Also, we just got last week an America 250 Connecticut Humanities grant to help with some of that. Louise Wagner's here, she helped me do it, I couldn't have done it at all, so thank you, Louise. So we're starting to get there, but we do need help from the people of Reading. The biggest help is buy a ticket, come to see it. It's a 500 seat. You're going to see a world-class orchestra in a very intimate setting. It's going to be absolutely amazing. But we need people to come. And we also, for those who can help, I think I put a little flyer on everybody. If you're able to help, you can donate. If you know people who would like to sponsor, please let me know. But the other thing is just to get the word out. So tell your friends and neighbors about this, and so that we could make this happen for the kids and for the community. The other thing, if you can sponsor, there's different sponsor levels, that would be wonderful as well. We're going to try and do some other events. We're going to, the historians, and I saw Ellery's here, we're going to try and do a walk through Putnam Park with a little history talk about the park, and the Land Trust is helping out with that. So, you know, I just want to spread the word, get everybody involved. Hopefully we'll do something with the Historical Society. Bruce and Brent are going to do another talk on Ives, and I think Chris Bro might join and talk about Ives' music. And we're also going to have, at the concert, we're going to have somebody from Yale come and talk about the music of Charles Ives. So you're going to hear about it, and you're going to hear it. So, and then we may do one other fundraising if you guys think this would be cool. The first movement in the three places of New England is about the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, the African American regiment that fought at Fort Wagner. And it was the basis for the movie Glory, which is, I haven't seen it in years, but I remember it being an amazing movie. So when we thought maybe we'd do a fundraiser, and everybody could come out, see the movie, have some beverages, probably at the Bethel Cinema. So I'll be letting everybody know about these upcoming events. But if we could have the support of the community, we could make this happen for the kids, and we could hear some amazing music. So, thank you guys. May 30th, this is the information. We've got a little QR thing. Tickets will probably go on sale in March, and I hope you can come out and support it. Thank
you. You talked about the stealing of the animals and whatnot from the farmers. Was there any targeting of knowledge of what farmer was supporting one side of the war or not, and whether they?
I mean, because you got people coming from Canada, New Hampshire, all the different parts of Connecticut.
Yeah, they were equal opportunity thieves.
They were just hungry.
Yeah, they were hungry. I mean, you raise a good point, but I don't think, there wasn't, people that lived along the ridge were, for the most part, loyalists. People who lived along Longtown, this section, were for the most part for the revolution. But I don't think I think if they saw a cow was dead. That's what I'm at.
Right, exactly.
I was just wondering whether you can talk a little bit about Georgetown and whether it had a different kind of character from the rest of Reading, during this period, or
It's a little early for Georgetown, really, because Gilbert Bennett pretty much is what came to Georgetown. That wasn't until the 1800s.
We're still in the long lots, kind of like part of the world at that moment in time. I think there was a mixture of loyalists and independents. So you hear about the Tory hole where the loyalists were hidden and down by the 107 bridge. But I think it's just the same as it would have been in between the ridge and in Reading Center. I think it was just a mixed bag. You know, everyone was just kind of like it was a great time of confusion and angst for everyone because you know we didn't really know what was going to happen.
Most everything revolved around the two churches, you know, the Anglican Church and the Congregational Presbyterian Church.
And we had that kind of thing going on in Georgetown as well. But yeah, they're kind of wedged, you know, in the West End, Wilton area. There was definitely some issues down that way, but yeah, nothing really specific stands out. Hands up with that there.
Once the war was won, were many of the Loyalists forced to go to Canada?
Yep, in 1783, they had a town meeting, and I don't know exactly the number of them, but there was probably about 20 or 25 that were expelled. If they had fought for the British, like for the Queen's Rangers or something like that, they were expelled. They were given safe passage to Long Island, and in Long Island, they had British ships, and they worked all during the fall to try to get them out of here, and they took them mostly to New Brunswick. And in New Brunswick, King George gave every one of those families that had fought for the crown, gave them, I think it was 60 acres of land that they gave them. And they settled, there's a number of Loyalist settlements up in New Brunswick. Yes,
Just to the north of Reading, up Poverty Hollow, is an area called Dodgingtown, and I heard that was where Loyalists hid out. Is that true? Do you know anything about
the
that?
Loyalists had to actually hide out because they said there wasn't.
There was a couple stories I remember of, you know, people deserting and hiding out in that area heading.
Well, yeah, if you deserted, yeah.
Yeah.
If you were just a Loyalist, unless you were really vocal, some of the vocal ones, you know, they confiscated their properties, they put them in prison. But for the most part, if you just wanted to remain loyal to the king, as long as you weren't advocating, you know, fighting against the Continental Army or doing something like that, you're pretty much left alone.
I had heard that Dodgingtown was named after tax dodgers.
Makes sense. Yes, back there.
I go to Christ Church, Episcopal Church, and we have two stories. And one was that when the British came along and stopped with Tryon, or not Tryon, with Heron, that they camped on the corner in the field that's now protected by the land trust across the street on Carriker's Field. And but they took pot shots. They were using the weather vane on top of the church as for target practice. So we have the original weather vane inside the church that supposedly they were shooting at. And also another event was one of the couple of, it was a little group, I guess, of the Patriots came from the center of town up and came into the church when Beach was preaching and demanded that he stop praying for the king. And he refused to do it. So they shot at him, but they missed. And we have this musket ball and a plaque in the narthex of the church.
The story on that one is Stephen Betts, who had the tavern across the way,
Yeah.
offered a pint of French brandy to anyone that would go in and shut Beach up.
We have, supposedly, they found a musket ball when they were doing some renovations, so it's mounted on a
definitely
plaque.
And yeah, and like, whether he was in Reading or Newtown, like he suffered greatly for preaching for the king. So every time that he preached in, he had problems with probably the Sons of Liberty.
Every one of his sermons was started with "God bless the king."
Right.
You know, and he refused to drop that. He was sanctioned, given. He was sent a letter by the selectmen in Reading asking him to please refrain from doing that, and he just goes, "No,
The book, My Brother Sam is Dead, that they used these characters in the story A lot of the names are on the gravestones in the churchyard there. So a lot of times they bring kids over to the church to see those.
We use those marks
markers.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Anyway,
that's that neat connection too. It's just, Bruce mentioned, when they took the prisoners, when they came up in 1777, like that little triangle, if you will, right before, Black Rock, from, they're on a stone that was dedicated by the historical site here years ago. And if there's an asterisk by their name, that meant that they died in the smallpox houses or prisons, if you will.
Could you talk a little bit about the militia? How did it form? Were they supplied with any weapons? And also, would people in the militia not be interested in being in the Continental Army?
Well, the militias were.
I printed this out because this is a rabbit hole that I went down too. So basically, around the late 1730s, we started to form militias. And obviously, we have two militias here. So one's Anglican and one's Presbyterian, so east and west. So before this, there was something called a train band, and that was basically militias formed just in case there was attacks from Native American Indians or others. So we become a part of the 4th Regiment of the Connecticut Militia, which belonged to Fairfield because we did. And then things kind of go from there in the 1750s. So we have Western militia officers, Samuel Sanford, he's the captain, Daniel Hall, John Reed, probably John Reed 2 or 3. And then the east is the Joshua Hall, James Morgan, and Daniel Lyon. So both militias serve with British troops in the French Indian War, and then even the battles of Lexington and Concord. But then when we're called to duty for the Battle of Long Island, the ones on the ridge say we're not going to do that, and that's when they get court-martialed for not showing up. So really, the militias were formed kind of like, I think of it as kind of a local fire department, where they have certain training days, and basically get into what we're going to do, and maybe this happens and that happens. But we really don't get into real skill until really when the troops come here to Reading in the encampment. So militias were just groups of men that obviously have muskets, and they're training to kind of just in case something bad happens.
And the militiamen lots of times only served for very short periods of time when they were needed. Lots of times they would fight in a particular battle, so they would only serve for a week or 2 weeks, and then they would go home and farm again. When they finally came in with pensions in the 1830s, for the militiamen to collect a pension, it was really difficult because you had to serve at least 6 months, but it didn't have to be 6 months in a row. But you had to remember the dates, the exact dates that you served. And they did it by, you had to give affidavits, and they had to have multiple people give it, and there had to be a lot of collusion because nobody could remember the exact dates that they served 35 or 40 years ago. And every one of those affidavits, they all matched so that they could get their, but it would be like they would serve 7 days here, 15 days here, sometimes 3 months, depending on what the campaign was and stuff like that. A lot of the people here served in the militia, and they went down to Fairfield to guard the coast during the war, and they would serve for short periods of time.
If that's important, there's a book that's in the library here called Call to Arms, and that's all those people asking for basically a pension. So it's all great, primary source data about that topic and what they did and what happened. So there's some incredible stories within it.
And there's a lot of really good records for the pensions, which are particularly interesting because when you get into some of those records, there's as many as 60 and 70 pages worth of affidavits, and it describes the period of time of the war from right through the beginning right to the end.
Brent and Bruce, I think we could listen to you all night. Maybe we have time for one more question.
You got a follow-up though, right?
I want to know when the burning of Fairfield took place.
1779.
79, yeah.
Yeah.
Was that force the one that also came up Black Rock Turnpike?
No, that was 1770. So like, the thing about Danbury burning, it was the only time that the British came interior into Connecticut. After that, it was all across the coast, and they just nailed from Fairfield up all the way, just coastal. We taught them a lesson, I guess. I don't know.
Okay. If anybody wants to buy a book, we've got some books here tonight. They're $20 a piece, and half of the money goes to the concert.
Thank you both for being here. Thank you.